Greetings, this is Bruce Ruby, the Nostalgia Catholic, with my next in the series of Isaac Asimov short stories as published in their original magazines. This one, of course, is the second part of the phrase, and now you don't. First part being now you see it, famous phrase, now you see it, and now you don't. So, once again, finally, Isaac Asimov gets the cover. Well, of the first magazine. The story is broken into three parts, serialized, if you will. And so that would be the November, the December, and January issues. So that is to say, the first one is November 1949 issue of Astounding Science Fiction. He's got the cover. You can see this kind of sort of figure here with a lot of mathematics. This young girl, Arcadia Darrell, very important. A sort of weird crystal skull kind of symbolizing the mysterious figures of the Second Foundation. The story, however, as I said, is serialized in three parts. The only other serialized story he has so far was the Mule, which was broken up into two parts. So the next part here is in this one, where some other story has the cover. So, but this would be the December 1949, and then finally there would be the next final closing part actually makes its appearance in January 1950. Now, just to note something, these things come out just a little before the month. In point of fact, January 1950 issue of Astounding Science Fiction came to the newsstands on December 20th, 1949, meaning that before 1950, all three parts of this, in fact, now at this point, all the parts of the Foundation that would appear on the pages of Astounding Science Fiction had done so. And so, in effect, other than what is to come later, the story really is complete. So, let's take a look at that. Are there much differences or things of interest in these? Yeah, well, not too much. When it comes to the text, surprisingly little. In fact, mostly a matter of additions more than anything else. There is some artwork, and other than that, the text is astonishingly similar. There's a couple very minor changes. We'll talk about those. But there really isn't much, except for one other thing. Well, two things, because there's three parts. Now, let's start with the first part here. So, it's listed under this category of serials, and Now You Don't, by Isaac Asimov, part 1 of 3 parts, starting page 5. So he gets the feature place in the magazine, too. So, here we get it. The artwork doesn't so much seem to portray anything in the story, but just the overall atmosphere. Here's Beta, you see her face. There's all these mysterious figures of the Second Foundation. You see their crystal skull and all these weird little planets and things with little lightning bolts as if their mental power is influencing these planets. Okay. And then there's these eyes watching. Always watching. Who's watching you? Who's watching the watchers? Okay. There's a little blurb, and it reads, "It was an inevitable, but not quite inescapable conflict. The first Foundation had to find the Second Foundation. The Second Foundation had to prevent it or die." Well, that makes it sound rather simple, except that, obviously there's a little more to it than that. There's another picture here, just showing 5 figures in various poses. There's 5 men who get together in a little conspiracy fairly early in this story. Then the next picture, somebody talks about using a sort of a sophisticated sort of a calculating machine. Let's see here. I don't know if I can find where. But anyway, so it's kind of the idea that it's supposed to be like a kind of a slide rule. Well, at least part of it in the guy's hand really looks like a slide rule. But all these hands going to the planet like globe or satellite or whatever kind of imply that it would be more advanced than just a regular slide rule. Even the thickness of the thing shown at the very edge of that thing is very tiny. kind of seems to suggest that maybe there might be a little more complexity to it. Just a bare, subtle suggestion, and 2 slides on there too, apparently, which is kind of cool. So, I don't know. It seems to, the idea is it's a more advanced kind of slide rule. All right, still a slide rule. Don't you love it? Okay, now here's another one. Again, this is kind of implying we're talking about the second foundation. And again, there's these various people who seem to be able to talk to each other through mentalic powers. And I think that's kind of the idea. They're mysterious figures who have this mysterious way of communicating among themselves. So, now, one thing that's been happening here is that one of the things that made Isaac Asimov so not like doing the Foundation stories is that he couldn't just come up with them bam, 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 bam. It took some weeks, months, sometimes years for enough inspiration to come along where he can actually solve the story or figure out how he's going to continue the story somehow. So, because of that, you don't have very much continuity, and more importantly, someone might say a new subscriber or just a new reader of the magazine will probably not have some or even all of the previous installments because they're so long before. This is coming out at the end of 1949. Before that, the first half of that saying, Now You See It, came out in the final part of 1947, in the January 1948 issue, which again came out late in the month of December 47, because it came out a little early. So that's really 2 years before this. So let's say you started Astounding, after that time. All you have is this final installment. You don't know what happened before. Rather than have all these big, lengthy synopses, what he decided to do was to incorporate that synopsis into the story. And at each stage, he's had to do this. At first, there wasn't much to recount. The first, one just called Foundation, we're not even told how all these scientist-type people and researchers and encyclopedists end up on Terminus. They're just there to do this encyclopedia, and the story of how that goes, is just kind of taken for granted. Even the little introduction of Hari Seldon giving this speech to his thing doesn't really tell much about how they got out there, how they were made to go out there, or anything like that. So, in the book, it's clarified. The whole new section of psychohistorians will explain all that and create a rational scenario. Then when you get to the next part, the bridle and saddle, is kind of, again, a summary of what the events were and how things went, and then, of course, also the little solving of the puzzle. So what did Salvor Hardin do? Okay. Then you get to the big and the little, and again, Hober Mallow has to explain to James Weir what a Selden crisis is, because James Weir is claiming, that's a long time ago in my schooling, I just forgot all about it, which is still ridiculous because that's so basic to the whole culture, to everybody except who got a priestly education. And it shows that James Weir did not have a history as a trader, despite his pretense that he did, but in fact had come from the priesthood. It also explains his particular and peculiar reactions to what goes on with the Corellian priest. So, the Wedge is kind of told as this little story. It's kind of self-contained. If you read the others, and especially the big and the little, you can kind of understand the context. If you haven't, it doesn't really cost you very much. There's a little bit of context, and that's where that got changed around a bit, and when it got put into the book, that had to be changed. I discussed that in that installment. And then finally, you get to the General, or Dead Hand, because Selden's dead hand is stronger than the General's living will, as which we find out. And the General is again learning from Dusambar about this whole history. So again, that recounts the whole thing. And then again, the Mule, they find some way to kind of, introduce bits of it in conversation. So he's always kind of keeping you abreast. So if you're coming in the middle, you have at least enough of an idea of what's gone before. You don't have any spoilers, that's kind of neat, but you do have just a sense of what's gone before, enough to make sense of the story that's in front of you. But this gets more and more difficult with each passing part. And this last part that he agreed to do for John Campbell is like, this is it. Okay, I'll make it big and wide and long and so forth, but this is going to be the end. This is it. It is over. Don't ask for another Foundation installment. This will be the Foundation installment to end all Foundation installments. Well, there's nothing John Campbell can do about that, but just be grateful he does at least have this one more. And he could also kind of drag it out a little further by breaking it into 3 pieces. Now, even though the Mule is only broken into 2 parts and this into 3 parts, in terms of actual word count, what's interesting, I've noticed that when he sells the story, these word counts are just kind of round figures. Oh, this is a 50,000 word story. This and the Mule are each considered 50,000 word stories. But actually, both had slightly less than 50,000 words, if you count them, which you can do automatically now with an editor or something. And it turns out the Mule has more words than And Now You Don't, but not by a huge amount, maybe less than a couple thousand words difference. But the Mule as a story actually is a little bit longer than And Now You Don't. Yes, And Now You Don't get sliced into 3 parts instead of 2. And which is kind of a shame, because in the middle of the second part, Asimov had actually produced a place for a cliffhanger. That would have been a perfect place to kind of, the first part of the story leaves Arcadia in this spaceport with nobody and nothing going on. She's running for her life from the Second Foundation. She doesn't know where to go, what to do, who to trust, anything. And because she's figured out where the Second Foundation is, she's got this terrible, the burden of this terrible knowledge, for which she knows she would certainly be killed if they knew that she knows what she knows. And so she's just, collapsing in this puddle of tears, wondering what to do next. Well, then the second half, she meets up with the Pulvers, who, find it very, she ends up going to Trantor and so forth and so on. That was a nice natural cutting off place that he put in the middle of the story. Very convenient. But A, to extend it a little bit, and B, John Campbell had this other thing going that was kind of interesting. The year before, which is to say the November 1948 issue of Astounding Science Fiction, he published a letter by somebody who was making predictions in this letter and commenting on the stories that he finds in the November 1949 issue of Astounding Science Fiction. Stories that don't exist, haven't been written yet. And so that prediction had to be kind of fulfilled. So he needed a little more room in the magazine to do that. So there's a lot of stories here where he actually went to these different science fiction writers and asked them to write stories to kind of go along to these titles and kind of descriptions, whatever, that the letter had provided. The idea being some unknown person out there prophesies the future. Yes, the November 1949 will have this story by this guy and that story by that, and this one's a really good one, and that one, well, wasn't the best, but blah 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 blah. He's writing them just like people would write in about the stories they read, in the last one they had read. So it was kind of a neat gimmick, and that just happened to fall right on the same month that it otherwise made sense to start publishing Asimov's And Now You Don't installment. But he had to shrink that a bit. Now, what's in there? What's as far as the difference? It's amazing how little difference there really is. In fact, in the first part, the main differences are that the book adds a section from the Encyclopedia Galactica. No equivalent in the original. It just dives straight into the story. Nothing from Ligurn Vier either, interestingly enough. Just Daryl Arcady, novelist, born 11/5/362 FE, died 1/7/443 FE. Although primarily a writer of fiction, Arcady Darrell is best known for her biography of her grandmother, Beta Darrell, and so forth. Now, there's something else in here. It describes her as a writer of fiction. That will relate to something, a small change we'll see in the later sections. All right. Now, there's one other thing that is in this original and not in the later. And that has to do with the fact that there is a small footnote. And the thing is, yes, you've got Arcady Darrell's, trying to write this paper that kind of summarizes the history of the Selden plan. So, that's what he had to do. It's like, don't ask me to come up with some other way to introduce what happened before in another story. That's part of the reason you didn't want to twist the snake any further. But there's a footnote, and let us see that footnote on page 10, where it says, oh, by the way, in case you don't have access to, I'll just read it here. If a more formal and slightly longer version of the history of the Foundation is desired than is given in Arcadia's theme, without the necessity of wading through the formidable and definitive essays on history by Ligurn Vier, reference may be made to the following stories appearing in earlier issues of this magazine, and it lists all the installments. Foundation, Bridle and Saddle, The Big and the Little, The Wedge, Dead Hand, The Mule, Now You See It. So, and which issues they were, so where to find them. So, Essays on History by Ligurn Vier. That's the only mention of Ligurn Vier in this. Okay. So, obviously, in the book, if you've got, presumably, if you're reading this, which would be in Second Foundation, you should have been reading, the original Foundation book and then the Foundation and Empire book. Well, that's its own little tussle there, but let's assume you have. Okay, there's another little squib, again from the Encyclopedia Galactica, that gets added for the book. Mathematics. The synthesis of the calculus of n variables and of n-dimensional geometry is the basis of what Selden once called my little algebra of humanity. Okay, and there's a single reference of encephalography in the original, which in the book becomes electroencephalography. Okay, whatever. So, that's it for the first. And so what happens as they actually sliced it? So, by the time we get to the end of this book, Arcadia has spied in on her father and his 4 friends who had this whole conspiracy to try to look into the Second Foundation and what they can do, because they feel they've got to stop it. There won't be their own masters as long as there's a Second Foundation out there somewhere. And people will get passive and not struggle because they feel like, well, there's a Second Foundation. It'll protect us. We don't need to defend ourselves or build the empire, the Second Empire. And that would destroy it. So it is important that the Second Foundation be regarded as destroyed, basically. That's what has to happen. So it gets as far as one of their number, a librarian named Homer Munn, Munn, M-U-N-N, not Mud, Munn, M-U-N-N, who he always stutters almost every thing he tries to say. He stutters all the time, and it goes through that all the time. It's kind of tedious, and you can just imagine what it must be like being anybody who knows him, listening to him talk. That could be very demanding of patience, and I feel for people who stutter, it's very difficult. They have to deal with that. But at any rate, poor Homer Munn, he's a librarian, he's very intelligent, he stutters. But she hitches a ride with him secretly. They don't know she's been listening, but she's been listening. She had a little spy equipment all set up, and she got through a classmate. This whole story, I'll leave that out. That's fun to read, but it's not a major plot point. So going on. So she's going to smuggle herself on the ship where Homer Munn is flying out to Calvin, which is where the Mule is. Or rather, where the Mules had been and finished his rule. Now he's dead. He's been dead for however long. And some other guy, just an ordinary human, has succeeded him as first citizen. Needless to say, being an ordinary human, the huge, portion of a galactic empire the Mule had put together falls apart immediately. And basically, the guy just rules the planet Calgon and maybe 1 or 2 minor worlds very close by, but that's about it. The empire that the Mule built up is pretty much collapsed. But he still calls himself first citizen. He's the successor of the Mule and all this kind of stuff. Lord Stettin, and his live-in lady concubine, Lady Kalia, who, well, let's see. Anyway, so she smuggles herself in with that, and all of a sudden, he's all, well, I guess I better turn around and go back because this has happened. And she's all, no, I left a note. My dad knows where I am, and he got a nice little letter saying, I'm really having a wonderful time here with Uncle Homer, and don't worry about me. We're doing just fine, you know. And they all just decide to leave well enough alone. He's just taking his niece, you know, family friend's daughter, to this great trip. Who really wanted to go? Calgon's kind of the Disneyland of the Galactic Empire in those days, or what's left of the Galactic Empire, or the places that were the galaxy now. It's the Disney World. Before Disney existed as a world, so that's kind of cool. I don't know what it had in terms of carnival rides, but it had lots of beaches and just, I don't know, I'm sure it must have had something. But at any rate, so it was like a kind of resort place, and you go there and people have their holidays. And but that's also had been the Mule's planet, and they want to go and see because they kept the Mule's palace undisturbed from when the Mule died. And Homer wants to go there and investigate stuff so he could try to do as much research as possible. What were the Mule's searches for the Second Foundation? That's what they're going to do. But it just ends with he finds that this girl is in his spacecraft. She can't hide any longer, and she has to reveal herself, and it's a big explosion, and then what? So it kind of leaves us off at, it's not too bad of a cutting off point. All right. Now this gets followed with the next installment in the December issue. Now, this one starts with something that's kind of cool. You don't get this in the books. This is gone. And it's a synopsis of the first part, which also kind of brings in a little bit more of the previous stuff. Here's the synopsis. In the dying days of the First Galactic Empire, the psychohistorian Hari Seldon had caused to be set up 2 foundations at opposite ends of the galaxy to serve as reservoirs of scientific knowledge during the anarchy that would follow the final fall of the Empire, and as sources from which a new and greater empire would rise. The first foundation was a world of physical scientists which gradually grew in strength and importance through the centuries as it followed the course of a great plan, which had been calculated out in advance by Seldon and his school through their mathematized development of sociologic and economic currents, and consequent ability to predict the course of future history. The first check to that plan occurred when a mutant, known as the Mule, with unusual mental powers, conquered the first foundation together with much of the galaxy. Since the Mule was a biological accident, his coming could not be dealt with by Seldon's psychohistory, which was a statistical science that predicted probabilities only. However, there still existed the second foundation, whose location and nature had been kept thoroughly secret through the centuries. They were the mental scientists, whose function it was to guard the plan against just such unforeseen disturbances as the Mule. By means of a mighty effort, they succeeded in stopping the mutant, and after his death, in reorganizing the first foundation. Now, except for the after the death part, that's what the previous installment, now you see it, had been about. The second foundation stopping the Mule. But obviously, since that happened, the first foundation got reorganized. Well, continuing the synopsis. Unfortunately, this violent disruption of the calculated course of history had not been adjusted quickly enough. Seldon's original plan had called for the foundation of a new empire 1,000 years after the fall of the old, in such a manner that mankind would finally be ready to form a society based on mental science rather than physical science. In this manner, mankind's first truly healthy and stable culture would be formed. War and misery would be forever ended. The first foundation was intended to form the political framework of a single universal state, while the second foundation was to prepare a world of mental supermen who would form the leading class of the new empire. Now, in addition to the course of history having been diverted from the planned course, the second foundation, through the necessity of stopping the Mule, had revealed their existence to the galaxy, in particular to the first foundation. This was dangerous, since the second foundation was physically helpless and could be easily destroyed once their location was known. Everything depended on secrecy. In addition, the masses of the First Foundation, secure now in the knowledge that they would be protected against all fluctuations of history by the Second Foundation, relaxed and allowed their nation to become weak and hedonistic. Worse still, to a small percentage of the First Foundation, the proven superiority of the Second aroused hostility and antagonism. All of this the Second Foundation, with their eyes on a glorious future for mankind, must combat while maintaining their own precarious safety. Among those of the First Foundation were those conspiring against the Second in a burst of angry and honest patriotism was Dr. Toran Darrell, son of the woman Beta Darrell, who had been the most effective opponent of the Mule, outside of those of the Second Foundation themselves. Interesting. So maybe the Second Foundation, well, maybe that's just talking about how the Foundation took care of the Mule, and now you see it. Okay. Dr. Darrell was an encephalographic analysis and psychophysicist who specialized in the study of the electric currents of the brain. By this means, he hoped to develop a method of identifying any Second Foundationer through the distinctive pattern of brain currents made inevitable through the latter's possession of unusual mental properties. Aiding him was Peleus Anthor, a young pupil of Dr. Darrell's dead colleague, Dr. Cleese. Anthor had brought to Terminus, capital planet of the First Foundation, the results of Cleese's encephalographic researches, which indicate that the First Foundation is riddled with agents of the Second. These agents are citizens of the First Foundation who, through mental adjustment, have been converted into unconscious assistants to the mental supermen of the Second Foundation. These tampered men represent some of the best of the First Foundation's businessmen, scientists, and intellectuals. Darrell had broken with Cleese some years previous, thus creating hard feeling between the two, in order that he might pursue his researches absolutely alone, and therefore with greater safety. Now, however, he felt obliged to join with a few others, all of whom were clear of the possibility of being Second Foundation agents through studies of their brainwaves. The group decides to send one of their number to Calgan, former capital of the Mule, where information might exist as to the investigations made by the Mule in his own futile attempts 50 years earlier to locate the Second Foundation. Homer Munn, librarian and antiquarian, is chosen for the task. Arcadia Darrell, Dr. Darrell's 14-year-old daughter, an active, romantic, and precocious girl, has secretly overheard the discussions of conspirators and, in search of adventure, stows away on Munn's ship. There is no way of bringing her back since the conspirators chiefly fear attracting attention to themselves through any unusual action. Now, we get to a couple other differences that again reflect something I mentioned regarding the first part. She's telling Homer Munn while they're writing, I'm going to be a historian, originally. In the book, it becomes, I'm going to write historical novels. And so, going on, my history is going to be interesting, and it's going to whatever, In other words, like she plans to be this real serious historian. And now, in the book, it's my novels are going to be interesting and are going to whatever. There's a place where, for some reason, there's a reference to the old place of the Mule, which becomes the old palace. Probably an A got dropped out in the original Astounding printing, so that's probably a fix. Then there's another small quote from the Encyclopedia Galactica that the book version adds. Trantor. By the middle of the interregnum, Trantor was a shadow. In the midst of the colossal ruins, there lived a small community of farmers. So, a couple of very minor things. There's a place where even upon himself drops out, and then something about where probably some explosion or some weapon leaves a giant stain behind, or it's to clarify in the book, behind, to mark the passing of 1,000 men. And that is a sum total, other than, well, there's also the artwork. So let's take a look at that. Again, it's in serials, and now you don't. Let's see here, part 2 of 3 parts, page 120. So when you're just continuing a serial, you don't get at the beginning when you start. So now let's take a look here. You have this scene here. This is some sort of like a passport with looks like a $500 or $5,000 or 5,000 credit bill in there. And here's Arcadia Darrell. The idea is that the Supreme Pulver bribed an official on Calgan to pretend that she had her papers in order to go to Trantor. And the bribe was accepted. So there's another picture here. Now this is a rather fascinating view. I like this picture. Arcadia Dorel, that's half of it, and here's the other half of it. Now you notice the whole sky is filled with these squares. So they're not ceiling tiles. There's this extremely vivid scene where these light energy beams in the form of these lattice squares slowly descend upon the crowd so that they can search that crowd systematically, square unit by square unit, until they know that they've gotten everybody, because you don't pass from one to another. You see? So you see some rockets, because it isn't a terminal, space terminal where people take off. And you see some people there and some buildings and things like that. So that's kind of cool. And they do this whole search. And in fact, after that search, when they get down to Arcadia, that's when Preem Pulver bribes the guard. And all that was for nothing. And then here's some more. First Citizen, probably the guy standing there with his hands behind his back. And maybe that's Homer Munn there, kind of telling him what he's found in the Mule's palace and digging around through all these records. And this is kind of an interesting picture. I'm not even quite sure what to make of this. It doesn't seem to coincide with anything in the story. There's this hand. If you look carefully, there's looks like three little figures coming along, trying to grope about, figure out where they are, who they are. And I think the idea is, who's the manipulator? Who's the puppet master? Whose hand is really dictating affairs? But I don't know what the three figures are, so I'm not quite clear on that one. But it kind of makes a neat picture in any way. And it kind of captures the idea of trying to figure out who's behind all this. So we pick up Arcadia and Homer Munn. Well, they've discovered each other, they've reconciled each other, and they continue on. Homer Munn wants to get to the library. He can't. Arcadia sits down with Lady Kalia and manages to make it all sound like it would be really neat if Homer Munn could get in there. Lady Kalia comes to Poochie, that is to say, Lord Stetton, that's his private personal pet name when they, well, whatever. Oh, Poochie, okay. He ends up deciding to let Homer Munn into the Mule's palace after all, and Homer Munn goes in and gets to investigate after all. And Arcadia has a grand old time. Foundation credits go a long, long ways on Calgon, so she's just living it up, stocking up on all the neat stuff that she wants and doing all the fun things there's to do on Calgon, which apparently a lot of that still exists, so that's nice. It's even apparently where a lot of the big movie stars and music stars are, so it's kind of a mixture of Disneyland and Hollywood. I mean, it's a big place. I mean, it's a whole planet of this kind of stuff. So she's having a good old time. But then something when she realizes, well, Lord Stetton has these science art. She's a 14-year-old girl, and he wants to make her his concubine. That's very, very indecent. And I mean, even in 1949, I think people would have to say that's really pretty odd. And now we look back on it, that's like, I mean, what kind of creepy old guy tries to seduce a 14-year-old girl? So between being legitimately justified to get her out of that situation, and also Lady Kalia, as it turns out, we find out in here, she sees it in this glance that Lady Kalia gives her. She knows Lady Kalia is a member of the Second Foundation. No ifs, ands, or buts. And she's now, even though Lady Kalia is being her friend and helping her and all this stuff, she's more scared of her than everything else she ever saw there. Even more scared of her than the prospect of being made Lord Stetton's concubine. I mean, none of that means anything. Lady Kalia is a Second Foundation, and I gotta get the hell out of here. So, that's how she ends up at this terminal with not knowing what's going on. Preem Pulver is there, and his wife. I don't think we see her name anywhere, but anyway, I'll just call her Mrs. Pulver. And they're there. There's this old elderly farm couple who just, Oh, they're just lovable. Um, and they go with her. She goes with them to Trantor, and it turns out she was born there. Apparently, Toran and Beta stayed on Trantor for some years, long enough for uh, they had a son that was Daryl. Well, that was her father, and then even that father had a wife and this daughter. The wife, I don't know what happened to her, and so now he and the daughter, when she's a little girl, left and went back to Terminus. But she was born on Trantor, so she goes back to Trantor. So finally, the final part we have here, and again, it's more serial. Now you don't. And that's in late page 111. So now we've concluded this thing. No artwork, just a blurb that reads, conclusion. For stability, the Foundation had to find and extirpate the second Foundation. For success, the second Foundation had to let them. And for survival, the second Foundation couldn't permit it, of course. That summarizes things a bit better. In fact, I just realized I think I read the blurb associated with the second piece. Just read the blurb. Second of three parts. It can't be seen and must be found, with one small girl and a few bold men to seek the menace. Okay, I missed that. And then after that, another synopsis, which again is only in this Astounding Science Fiction original. I'll read this. Sorry, it's going to be a longer video than usual. Alright. Two foundations, established during the dying days of the First Galactic Empire, divide the universe. The first foundation, existing at the extreme end of the galaxy, has grown from a tiny world dedicated to keeping alive the flame of human knowledge during the crash of empire and regression to barbarism, has had its vicissitudes grown to power, been temporarily conquered by a mental mutant known as the Mule, and is now once more powerful and unchallenged. Except for the second foundation, it is the stronghold of mental science in the galaxy, and the guardian of Harry Seldon's plan, which is the scheme of history, predicted by the greatest psychologist of the old empire through his mathematized development of the sciences of sociology and economics to the point where statistical predictions could be made. The plan foresees the rebirth of a new empire through the science of the first foundation to be led by the mental supermen of the second foundation. But there are some men in the first foundation who don't like the thought of being led by those of the second. They feel themselves to be puppets, and life to be a mockery unless they can destroy the mentalists and once again be masters of their own fate, which I guess is what that picture of the hand and the people on it is supposed to symbolize. The second foundation, on the other hand, realizes that it must avoid being located by the men of the first. So far, through the centuries, the second foundation has existed in safety largely because of the fact that no man else knew their location except for that one vague hint that it was at the other end of the galaxy. Dr. Torrenderol is one of the first foundationers who are trying to locate the second. Aiding him is the young Peleus Anthor. Both are encephalographic analysts whose researches in brainwave data have convinced them that some of the best men on the first foundation have been mentally tampered with by the mentalists of the second foundation. As a move towards locating the enemy, Dr. Darrell sends another colleague, Homer Munn, to Calgan, a nearby world which had once been capital of the only conqueror the first foundation had ever experienced, the Mule. The Mule himself had once searched for the second foundation, unsuccessfully, and it was thought that among his records important evidence might be hidden. Along with Munn, as stowaway, goes Arcadia Darrell, Dr. Darrell's 14-year-old daughter, an active, romantic, and precocious girl who has overheard the discussions of the conspirators and has stowed away on Munn's ship. Together they land on Calgan. Calgan is under the dominion of Lord Stettin, so-called first citizen of the galaxy and successor to the Mule, who has gained his position through a coup d'etat some months earlier and who dreams of restoring the Mule's empire by reconquering the first foundation. He allows Munn a free hand in the latter's investigations while he prepares for war. Eventually, as he gains confidence, he places Homer under arrest and plans to wait for Arcadia to grow a bit older so he might marry her and unite his house to one of the famous houses of the Foundation as a political stroke to complete the union that his military forces are to initiate. Lady Kalia, however, Stefan's fading and weak-minded mistress, naturally disapproves of this last part of the plan, secretly helps her new rival to escape from Calgan, and urges Arcadia desperately to return to the Foundation. But as she does so, Arcadia catches a glimpse of amusement and triumph in Kalia's eyes, which are completely out of character. Arcadia realizes instantly that Kalia is actually a member of the Second Foundation, and knows that she must seek safety. She dares not return to the First Foundation, since that is where Kalia sends her, and which, therefore, obviously hides a trap. Arcadia's dilemma is increased when she discovers that it has become obvious to her where the Second Foundation must be located. She realizes that she is now the most important person in the galaxy, and the one least likely to remain long alive. That she managed to get away from Calgan alive is due to the help given her in her panic by Preem Pulver and his wife, a good-hearted middle-aged pair of merchants from the agricultural world of Trantor. Trantor had once been the capital of the First Empire and a gigantic metropolis, but it had long since degenerated to a world of backwoodsmen. Arcadia herself had been born there, and at the time when her father had been investigating the old Imperial Library for details as to Selden's plan, and, of course, the location of the Second Foundation. Preem Pulver, asking no further than that Arcadia was a country woman, represented her to be his niece to the soldiers sent by Stefan to locate her, and ended by bribing the officer in charge and thus being allowed to leave. Arcadia cannot feel joy in the escape, since she is aware that she is probably only including two kindly people in the inevitable doom. The news of all this comes back to Dr. Torrendero via the same officer who had been bribed by Preem Pulver and who, it turned out, had been one of Peleus Anthor's personal agents on Calgan. Peleus Anthor, in private, informed his co-worker, Daryl, that the Second Foundation was on the trail, since brainwave analysis showed the bribed officer to be one of those tampered with. The conclusion was that all was known, and that Daryl had better follow his daughter to the safety of Trantor. Daryl refuses on the grounds that the Second Foundation deliberately arranged to have Arcadia go to Trantor in the hope that he might follow. Their only chance of survival, he insisted, was to do and continue to do the unexpected. As they argue, the news arrives that Calgan has declared war on the First Foundation, and to the healthy menace of the mentalists is added the pounding shift of the first citizen of Calgan. Wow. So, there's a small addition to the book made as another quote from Encyclopedia Galactica. Quarestian Battle of fought on 9/17/377 FE between the forces of the Foundation and those of Lord Stettin of Calgan. It was the last battle of consequence during the interregnum. So, in some places they would be badly, beaten or something. It's changed to clarify the Foundation forces would be badly beaten or whatever. So textual though, other than this huge change, the synopsis, there's nothing in the way of difference. I've already read the blurb part 3, so the only other thing left is, let's see what artwork we have here. So there's no artwork for the first page. So this is Trantor. That presumably is Preem Pulver, and there's Arcadia Daryl. This is just more, you can see there's still lots of ruins of what used to be all these buildings and skyscrapers that covered Trantor when it was a planetary city. But lots of that has been torn out, and there's more and more of this farmland. So in this case, the squares below are just parcels of land being growing, soybeans and wheat and corn and, whatever grows on Trantor. This is a rather curious shot where apparently a lot of ships, in the course of an attack from Calgan, suddenly surrounds Foundation all at once, and there's all these ships in the sky ready to attack. Wow, it's actually a pretty dramatic picture. I like that. And then, let's see here. Then there's the part where one of the other guys of the 5, a guy named Semic, was contracted to make some sort of a mental static device. If you're a Second Foundationer, this thing ought to be like a blindingly bright flashing light in your face would be to a seeing person. If you're blind, you wouldn't notice it would bother you, but if you see this thing go in your face, really, just drive you nuts. And the mental static would do the same thing. If you're not a Second Foundationer, you won't feel a thing. But if you're a Second Foundationer, whatever mental senses that allows you to be the second foundation, do all this influence, is going to be have all this crap and noise thrown in its face. So this comes to a point where he's created this device and he turns it on, and as you can see, somebody there, and I won't spoil it by saying who, turns out to be a second foundationer, because he's collapsing in agony from this thing going on. So, but meanwhile, there is still the second foundation, crystal skulls and mathematics and people. Who are these people? But they're the second foundation. I'm not sure, but I think that's the end. Let's see if there's any more. Yeah, that's all there is. So the situation resolves itself in a story that, like I say, is, apart from what I said, exactly identical to the book. So, a great story, a great summation to the whole Foundation thing. You can kind of see why there's not much necessity in continuing, so he didn't, and he didn't want to. And I really, thank you for listening to this exceptionally long